Boldwood presents Camelot, written by Peter Gibbons and read by Sean Barrett. Then to Hrothgar was granted glory in battle, mastery of the field, so friends and kinsmen gladly obeyed him, and his band increased to a great company. It came into his mind that he would command the construction of a huge mead hall, a house greater than men on earth had ever heard of. From Beowulf, an Old English poem written in the 9th century, set in the 6th century. Chapter 1. 547 A.D. Britain. The war for Britain raged, a time of blood, conquest and shield walls. A wolf age, a storm age, a time of spears, shields and swords. The age of Arthur. 800 Saxon warriors trampled across a field of soft heather. Wind shook the undergrowth about their heavy boots as they led wagons full of plunder westwards. Wooden wheels creaked and groaned beneath the weight of stolen ale barrels, hocks of ham and sides of beef, wood axes, iron spits, furs, and rolled wool. They sang a rowing song in their coarse, brutal language, keeping time by clashing axe blades against iron shield rims. Purple flowers spotted the heather, and fields flowed like the sea, blown by the same breeze that whipped away columns of smoke, rising behind the Saxons, as evidence of the destruction left in their wake. Laughter and song drifted across the land, as big men with long braided hair and beards, hard-baked leather breastplates, spears, axes, and fur about their necks and shoulders, marched west towards Britain's heartland, from the east coast south of Bernicia. Daring men and Saxon warriors who had rowed across the wild sea on shallow, drafted warships, braving ferocious storms and waves like mountains. They had rowed those clinker-built vessels across the grey-green surging whale road, the narrow sea which separated Britain from Armorica, Benwick, and the lands of Saxons, Jutes, Angles, and Franks, to bring their blades and their malice to a land already brutalized by raids and invasion. Such men risked their lives, surviving treacherous waters, placing their lives in the hands of their gods, Woden and Thoror, leaving behind farms, mothers, wives, and children. They came for silver, women, land, reputation, and glory, just as thousands of their countrymen had done before. The Britons called them all Saxons, but the men who came across the sea were also Angles and Jutes, men from hard lands swept to ruin in the murderously lawless days after the collapse of Rome's vast empire. "Is that a bird's wing?" asked Kay, his chestnut eyes squinting as he peered down into the valley at the marching Saxon column. "An eagle's wing," Arthur said. A brute of a man with a tattooed face and arms like ale barrels strode before the Saxons, carrying the eagle's wing on a long pole. It was their battle standard, a symbol of their commander's prestige. "When did their ships arrive?" 2 weeks ago, we think. They've already sacked 3 villages since then." Arthur glanced up at the sky, and then at fallen leaves whipped across the land by a swirling wind. "This should be the last of them. The Swallows and Swifts have gone, so no more ships will come until spring." "Are they aligned with any of the Saxon kings?" "It doesn't matter." "Why not?" "Because we are going to kill them anyway." Arthur stalked away from the hilltop hidden from the Saxons below, turning to where 500 men in black cloaks awaited him, carrying shining leaf-shaped spears and shields scored by blades, their helmets dented, and their clothes stained and faded. Hard faces stared back at him, broken noses, men with missing fingers, and eyes like flints. They saw a tall man in a shining coat of chainmail armor and a night-black cloak about his shoulders, a bright helmet topped with a plume of raven feathers, and a sword belted in a red scabbard at his waist. The sword, a gift from Merlin the Druid. Ned, god of war, named the blade Camelot when she was forged in the distant mists of time. Ambrosius Aurelianus had wielded her glorious edge during the Great War, when men called the sword Excalibur, and now she belonged to Arthur. He rolled his shoulder to soothe its constant ache, a gift left there by a Saxon spear point. Arthur locked eyes with his men, noticing how they lingered upon his face, torn and scarred by King Uther Pendragon's sword, when they had fought beneath the great standing stones on Serviodunum's sweeping plains. Arthur had killed Uther that day and become Pendragon himself. He was the Dux Bellorum, Britain's warlord, steward of Dumnonia, high king, warrior, and killer of Saxons. "Do we fight?" asked Dewey, the captain of Arthur's fiercely loyal black cloaks. He handed Arthur a heavy shield cut from lindenwood boards, ringed and bossed with iron. "We fight." Dewey grinned and hefted his own shield. "Then, do we go home?" Arthur clapped him on the shoulder and glanced up at a shifting afternoon sky, the colour of a burned cauldron. "Do you miss your wife?" "It's been 5 years, Lord, since the Battle of the River Douglas, and I can count on one hand the weeks we've spent with our families since. Even in winter, we stayed away from Dumnonia, fighting cursed Saxons with ice in our beards." "After today, we'll go home. You have my word." What passed for a smile curled the corner of Dewey's mouth. The tall, lugubrious warrior nodded towards the men. "A rest will do them good." "But not for long. You are right, it has been too long since we fought the Saxon hordes at the River Douglas. Since then we've fenned the enemy back, and yet still Reged, Gododin, and Lothian do not recognize me as Pendragon. There must be a reckoning in the north before long." "We've been too busy killing Saxons, Lord. And yet there are always more. Ready the men." Arthur left Dewey to bark and jostle the men. Spears clanked against shields, axes slid into belt loops as men drank the last of their ale and took a quick meal of cheese and black bread. Kay stood by his chestnut gelding and handed Arthur the reins to his own mount, Glumrai, a huge white stallion. Arthur stroked the horse's long nose, and it nuzzled his shoulder. "It's time," Arthur said to Kay, his foster brother. "You're sure this will work?" Kay asked, his curly hair tousled, as always, about his broad face. Arthur shrugged. War was about trickery, deception, maneuver, and slaughter. It was risk, scouting unknown hills and valleys, and luring an enemy into a fight on ground where he was unsure, and then falling upon him with ruthless savagery. Arthur had learned those hard facts in a lifetime spent with sword in hand, fighting implacable enemies who surrounded Britain, encroaching like wolves upon the flock he was duty-bound to protect. "It must work, or my black cloaks and I will die in the valley. The Saxons will cut us to pieces, and our corpses will rot in the field. Go to your men. You have 200 warriors who must be ready, almost half our force. Make sure Idnerth, Odin, and Einion are prepared." They both mounted, and Glumrai turned in a circle, stomping his powerful legs so that Arthur had to wrestle with the reins to keep the stallion still. "I'll see you after," said Kay, and he leaned forward to clasp Arthur's wrist in the warrior's grip. Black death-ring tattoos covered both men's forearms, and for a fleeting moment Arthur remembered how as boys at Caerligwalid, in the kingdom of Reged, he and Kay had dreamt of earning a warrior's death ring, the thin, tattooed ring warriors etched on one another's arms to signify a kill in battle. Those rings symbolized a warrior's reputation, the sign of a fighter's prowess, and one of the many ways of identifying a member of the elite warrior caste. Death rings had once seemed so important. Arthur and Kay had talked of them endlessly, running through the chaos forests, fighting with stick swords as they slew imaginary enemies and earned the rings every young warrior yearned for. Both men's arms were now more tattooed rings than unmarked skin. Arthur and Kay had slain so many that they had stopped adding rings to mark their kills. The blood of their enemies dunged Britain's battlefields, and there were always more enemies yet to fight. Kay galloped off down the hillside, and Arthur watched his brother and friend disappear beyond a copse of hazel trees. A fox darted from the trees, stared up at Arthur's black cloaks, and then darted back into the undergrowth. The fox was wise to seek cover, for soon those hills would ring with the din of war. A bark made Arthur smile, and his dog Camelot came bounding from amongst the men and leapt playfully at Lumbray's flanks, which the horse dutifully ignored. Camelot had once been a Saxon war dog. He was an enormous beast with slathering jaws, powerful head and haunches, but was now Arthur's loyal dog, who followed him everywhere, even onto blood-soaked hillsides where men screamed and the war god rejoiced in the malevolent joy of violence. "Today we face more Saxons," Arthur called to his men. The black cloaks stood to attention at the sound of his voice. Spears stood straight, iron points dull against the grey sky. "We face men come across the sea, following in the wake of those who have come before. Sea-wolves, slavers and murderers who seek to steal our land, kill our womenfolk and make our children their slaves. If they had heard of Arthur's black cloaks, perhaps they would have stayed at home with their goats and their wives. These are the last of this year's raiders. The rest of the Saxons hide behind their high walls, trembling at the thought of our black cloaks and our blades." The men chuckled and exchanged knowing glances. Lumbray whickered, and Arthur stroked his neck. "We are the men who protect Britain from her enemies. We are the swords who keep our people safe. We are the spears who drive the invader back into the sea. We are the Black Cloaks, the victors of Riverdlane and the Douglas. We have soaked our blades in Saxon blood. We are the Saxon killers." Arthur drew Excalibur from her red scabbard and held the mighty blade aloft, and the Black Cloaks roared and shook their spears in salute. "If we do not stop this horde fresh from the dark seas, they will kill and rape their way across Britain until they find land to take for their own, just as Octa, Ida, Hengist, Horsa, and Quickhelm did before them. Kingdoms have fallen to such men, but not today. We are the protectors of Britain, and if these men wish to make our land their home, they must trample across our bones to do it. Who do you fight for?" "Arthur! Arthur! Arthur!" 500 voices called back to him. "March then, you murderous whoresons!" Dowie barked at them, and they followed the captain down into the depths of the valley below. To reach that valley, the Saxons had to crest a rise which concealed Arthur's men from the west. Arthur wanted to lure them into his trap. He had to bring the Saxons to the fight and lead them into the bowels between ancient Britain hills. He was east of the old kingdom of Lindsey and south of Bernicia and Deira. Each were Saxon kingdoms occupying Britain's west coast and had belonged to the Saxons since their brutal warlords had thrown the Britons out with axe, sax, fire, and conquest. The Britons called the lands lost to the Saxons Angles and Jutes, Llugir, the Lost Lands. Arthur had spent 5 years pushing the Saxons back, further and deeper into Llugir, penning them back into their coastal fortresses and securing the borders of his under kings to keep his people safe. But more Saxons came each summer, new ships with new warriors, and Arthur must make an example of those who came across the sea. He must spread fear amongst their people, hoping that one day the boats might stop, and Britain could be at peace for the first time since the Roman legions had left it a desolate, lawless place, at the mercy of warlords and warriors. Arthur urged Lomroy into a canter, and Cavall followed, the war dog's tongue lolling as he ran alongside the great stallion. Arthur reached the hill's crest, and Lomroy reared on his hind legs, whinnying and raking the air with his forelegs. He wheeled the horse about and lowered down at the marching Saxons. Drops of rain pattered against Arthur's helmet, and he let Lomroy prance amongst the heather, cutting an unmistakable figure beneath the dark sky. The Saxons shouted and pointed at him, their leather and fur clothes in dour hues of brown and grey, and their leader came forth to stand beside the big man with the eagle-wing standard. The leader was a squat, bandy-legged man, with broad shoulders, and a wolf's head perched atop his own, and its fur draped down his back. He carried a wicked-bladed, long-handled war-axe, and he pointed the weapon at Arthur. Arthur ground his teeth and grinned mirthlessly. His heart pounded in his chest, because it was almost time to fight, almost time for the thunderous clash of arms, where men hewed and hacked at one another, lifted into a state of ecstasy by the exhilaration of danger, as they fought in the gossamer thin veil between this world and the next. A Saxon war horn blared, and 800 Saxon warriors quickened their pace in Arthur's direction, taking the bait. They saw a lord in his war finery, a man with a sword, helmet, and chainmail, each of which marked him out as wealthy. Capture Arthur's mail or sword, and a man would become instantly wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. He could buy his own ship, build a stout longhouse, roof it with thatch, and purchase 4 slaves to wait on his every need. All that man needed to do was cut Arthur down, kill the man who had cut the hand from King Ida of Venetia, who had killed Uther Pendragon in single combat, and slain Octa the Saxon warlord in a desperate riverside battle. Arthur dug his right knee into Lomroy's flank, and urged the horse down the hillside. He caught up with his men, who waited for him in the valley basin, where a sickly thin brook twisted its way through peat and bracken. Arthur took a spear from Howell, a trusted warrior, who wore the Roman Lorica segmentata armour of the men of Elmet, and a blood-red cloak about his shoulders. "Will they fight, Lord?" Howell asked, his hand resting on the hilt of his gladius, the short Roman sword he wore at his right hip. "They'll fight," Arthur replied, "and they'll die. Here they come." The big man with the eagle-wing standard was first over the western rise, and then hundreds of Saxons followed. They paused on the hill crest, staring down at Arthur and his 500 warriors. They had the larger force, but hesitated to face so many Britons. So far, they had fought only defenceless villagers and fishwives, and to face shields, spears, knives, and axes was enough to give any man pause. "Now we run," Arthur said. "Right, lads!" Dowie bellowed. "Run for your miserable lives and let the dogs see you do it!" He kicked the black cloak up the arse, and the men set off at a run. "Don't see why we're running from those shit-stinking curs," complained one black cloak. "'Cause them should be running from us," said another. "Just do as you're told," Dowie said, lumbering into a run, his buckles, straps, and weapons jangling. "We run, and then we kill. That's all you need to know." Arthur cantered ahead, turned his horse, galloped around his men, and then rode ahead of them as though he fled for his life. The Saxon war horn blared, and the horde came streaming down the hill like a pack of wild animals, weapons waving, voices undulating, and shouting their bloodlust. All hesitation fled from them like a tide at ebb. Men who had come to kill them ran away like frightened rabbits, and the Saxons smelled blood. Arthur led Lomroy over the next gentle rise, and down into a stubbled grazing pasture, sat before a dense forest like a horseshoe of green, surrounded by sprawling oak, ash, and elm trees stretching up and away to the east and north. Arthur leapt lithely from Llambroi's back and landed on the balls of his feet. He slapped the stallion's rump, and Llambrois cantered off towards the tree line. Arthur unslung the shield from his back and readied his spear. He stood alone in that scrap of bramble and nettle, and the forest creaked around him. Rain pounded the leaves and boughs like the sigh of the sea. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, taking in the damp rain smell upon the earth, chest heaving as he let the soil, grass, trees, wind, rain, and sky of Britain soak into his body, strengthening him for what must come next. The black cloaks ran down the slope towards Arthur and formed loose ranks behind him. "Do it badly now," Arthur ordered as his red-faced men came to a halt, puffing from the effort of running in leather and wool, carrying shields, long knives and spears. "Rugged lines and poor order, until I say otherwise." Howell and Dowie took their places to Arthur's right and left, and the rain stopped as the Saxons crested the rise and hurtled down the ridge. Sunlight punched through the broiling clouds, and golden shafts shone, glinting upon spears, helmets, and cloak-pins. "Hold!" Dowie growled, as the men shifted about Arthur, restless, spears held at odd angles, gathering in loose formation. The Saxons came on, teeth bared and eyes wild at the prospect of slaughtering a war band of frightened Britons. "Aron and Maponos, protect us," said Howell, calling upon the gods through gritted teeth. Every black cloak stiffened. Men touched amulets at their necks for luck and whispered to whichever god held their favor. Some men talked to themselves, urging their heart to stay strong and their weapon to strike hard. One warrior in the second rank vomited, and more than one pissed where he stood so as not to break formation. 800 Saxon killers hurtled towards them, intent on slaughter, their blades shining and their faces twisted with malevolent fury. It was time to stand and fight and show the Saxon sea warriors the price of raiding Britain. Chapter 2. The Saxons spread out in a wild charge, no ranks or discipline, just a wild, baying horde. Arthur flexed his hand around his spear's ash shaft, palm sweating, mouth dry. Enemy boots pounded the earth, and Arthur could feel every thud beating in time with his heart. He took deep breaths, fighting to hold his nerve until the right time, until the perfect moment to strike at the enemy. At 200 paces, he could make out men's flowing hair and the colours daubed upon their shields. At 100 paces, he could see eyes, teeth, and the iron trinkets braided into their beards. At 50 paces, 800 men filled the shallow valley, and their charge was enough to make even the stoutest warrior consider retreat. At 20 paces downwind, the acrid stink of their sweat and rank stench of their furs filled Arthur's nose, and he snarled. "Shield wall!" Arthur bellowed. The black cloaks gave a clipped roar in unison, and shields overlapped one another with loud clanks. Unruly spears became a forest of slanted points resting on iron shield rims, as the black cloaks formed 3 solid ranks of spears and shields, just as they had done so many times before. The lead Saxons paused, realizing that instead of an afraid, fleeing rabble, they instead faced organized ranks of well-armed, drilled, and grim-faced warriors. As the leading men slowed, the Saxons behind them kept on coming, and Arthur braced himself, shoulder behind his shield, overlapped one side by Hewell, and Dowie on the other. A long-faced Saxon with his beard woven into 2 ropes crashed into Arthur's shield. The force drove Arthur back half a pace. He braced his knee against the bottom of his shield just as the Saxon hooked his bearded axe over the top edge and tried to yank it down. Arthur's knee kept the shield in place, and so the spear thrust by the enemy behind the first Saxon, which should have ripped Arthur's throat out, instead found only stout shield boards. Arthur shrugged the Saxon off the shield and punched its heavy boss into the man's face. He stabbed with his spear, and the point tore through a Saxon's cheek. Arthur brought the weapon back and punched the blade into an enemy's chest. The first Saxon spat blood, his nose broken and mashed like a squashed turnip, and he beat at Arthur's shield with his axe. He crashed the axe blade down, catching Arthur's spear against his shield, breaking the weapon in two. Men pressed close, enemies heaving at one another, the Saxons held by the Black Cloak's impenetrable shield wall. A warrior in the rank behind Arthur howled in pain, and another Black Cloak gargled as a Saxon spear opened his throat. The iron stink of blood filled the air. Weapons hacked and clanged, and Arthur held fast. "They're getting around our flanks," said Dowie, and then ducked as a spear flashed above his head. "Hold," Arthur said, grimacing as the axe continued to thunder into his shield, its wielder shouting like a madman. The press of fighting men was too close to wield Excalibur's long blade, so instead Arthur reached to the small of his back and drew his sax. Its bone handle felt cool in his sweating palm as he held the weapon low. Its blade was as long as Arthur's forearm, with a single edge and a broken back tapering into a wicked point. Arthur stabbed the sax beneath his shield, but found only fresh air. He grunted and stabbed again, and this time the sax met resistance, its point cutting into soft flesh. Arthur twisted the blade as the Saxons stopped battering Arthur's shield, and instead howled in pain. Arthur drew the blade back and drove the Saxon down with his shield. He stamped down hard on the Saxon's throat and sliced his sax blade across another enemy's fist. Space opened up in front of him, and Arthur quickly glanced across the front line. Battle raged as 800 Saxon warriors surrounded his smaller force. If the fight continued, Arthur's men would surely die, surrounded and outnumbered. He laughed, a mirthless laugh of war joy, because the Saxons had done what he'd hoped they would. They had charged at an enemy they perceived to be weak and in flight, and now they would die. "Raise the dragon banner!" Arthur called above the din. "Raise the banner!" Dowie peeled away from the shield wall, and another man took his place next to Arthur. Moments later, the Pendragon banner, with its clawing dragon, rose from the Black Cloak's ranks high on a spear shaft. It waved in the sunlight, and the Black Cloaks let out a single roar of approval. A sound pealed out from the forest, metallic, undulating, and high-pitched, like an iron beast. "The Carnix," said a Black Cloak in the second rank. And so it was. The Carnix was a war horn, a long, curved bronze tube the size and shape of a spear shaft, topped by a magnificent bronze wolf's head, with its mouth agape and snarling. Arthur's war horn. The forest around the battlefield shook, as though a giant charged through its boughs, and hundreds of warriors raced from the woodlands, shaking their ground with their war cries. Guy led his warriors from the south. Idnerth and his warriors of Elmet, in their Roman plate armour, came from the west. Odin led 100 men of Gwynedd. Aenion 60 men from Powys, and Lancelot brought the warriors of Dumnonia to the fight. Hundreds of Britons, men of different kingdoms, who had once warred amongst themselves over grazing rights, boundaries, access to rivers, and cattle raids, all brought together beneath the Pendragon banner, fighting for Arthur, the High King of Britain. The Saxons wailed, the sound of their despair like the groans of lost souls wandering in the underworld. "Now kill them!" Arthur called to his men, his jaw set and eyes blazing. "Kill them all!" The Saxons broke away from Arthur's shield wall. Anger drained from them like water from a holed bucket. Warriors came from the forest on all sides, and the Saxons who had raced towards a fight with bloody slaughter in their hearts now faced death themselves. Arthur slid the sax back into its sheath at the small of his back, dropped his shield and drew Excalibur. He held the blade aloft, and the Black Cloaks let out a roar to shake the very ground. The sword's leather-wrapped hilt felt comfortable, like the god-forged weapon was made to fit his hand. Strength flowed into him from the sword, the blade given to him by Merlin, with which Arthur was to restore Britain to its people. Sight of the sword imbued his men with confidence and strength, and as the Saxons stepped away from the press of the shield wall, the fighting truly began. Arthur brought Excalibur down hard, 2 hands on the grip, and the tip slashed through a Saxon's face, splashing hot blood across the next Saxon, staining his flaxen hair crimson. Arthur stepped forward and drove the sword's point into the guts of that man, twisted the blade and ripped it free. Hywel, Dowie, and the Black Cloaks tore into the Saxons as their leader tried to jostle his men into some form of defensive battle order. Arthur saw him through the press, the squat man gesticulating wildly beside the enormous warrior holding the eagle-wing standard high. Lancelot and Kay reached the enemy first. Lancelot was tall and broad-shouldered. His flat, broad face shouted in anger, and his sword flashed. He crashed into the enemy with his shield, throwing 2 men from their feet, and Kay came with him, cutting and slashing with his deadly blade. Idna's warriors, in their Roman armour, strange shields and short swords, came not in a wild charge, but in an organized line, terrifying in its cold, inevitable precision. "Wyned! Wyned!" roared Odin, the champion of that kingdom. He was a monstrous brute of a man, and his huge axe swung with such ferocity that it hacked the Saxon's head from his shoulders with its first strike. Arthur parried an enemy spear thrust and ducked beneath a sax aimed at his face. He left those attackers to the Black Cloaks behind him, bounced off an enemy shield, and twisted around a blue-eyed Saxon staring at the incredible sight of Roman soldiers advancing on him, like warriors from legend. Arthur made for the Saxon leader, and the squat man turned, saw the chainmail, helmet, and sword, and he grabbed the shoulder of his monstrous standard-bearer and pointed towards Arthur. The big man snarled and thrust the standard at another of the squat leader's champions. The big man drew his axe and sax and came towards Arthur with fury in his wild eyes. A black cloak darted at the big Saxon, who swayed away from a spear thrust with the lightness of a dancer. He flicked his axe with a look of disgust on his face and opened the black cloak's throat with his axe's sharp edge. Arthur charged at him, lunging with Excalibur and forcing the big man to parry the sword with his axe. Arthur kept moving, feinting his body left and then darting to the right around his foe's axe hand. He stamped down hard onto the Saxon's knee and kept moving as the man's sax slashed at his midriff but found only his face. Arthur kicked the knee again and slashed Excalibur down hard onto the warrior's elbow, half severing his arm in a brutal cut. The big Saxon stared at Arthur, grimacing in pain, the shock of his terrible wound draining the colour from his face. Arthur killed him with a thrust of Excalibur's point. The sword punched through wolf fur and leather and into the man's broad chest. It met bone, and then found the Saxon's heart, piercing it and killing him instantly. Arthur dragged his blade free and swung towards the Saxon leader, only to find him trading blows with Lancelot. The Saxon leader's wolf's pelt fell from his head to lie amongst the blood and piss of the field, churned to filthy, stinking mud by the madness of battle. The long axe swung at Lancelot, but he caught its haft with his left hand and slashed his sword down hard onto the leader's collarbone with an audible crack. Saxons fighting beside their lord wailed with impotent sorrow as Lancelot killed their leader with the ease of a father practicing sword-play with his child. "Well met," said Lancelot as he caught Arthur's eye. He pulled the helmet from his head and grinned at Arthur, his strange cuirass of gleaming fish scales unmarked, and his hair and beard clipped close to his head. "Well met indeed." Arthur took his arm in the warrior's grip, and they watched together as the Saxons struggled and died beneath the Britons' anger. Idna's soldiers cut through the enemy like a wood saw, their short swords stabbing and cutting at men, and their shields battering them to the ground. "Are they Saxons?" Lancelot asked. Arthur wiped Excalibur's blade clean on the russet cloak of a dead enemy and slid her back into the scabbard. "Does it matter?" "I suppose not. They could be Jutes or Angles. All the same, really." The battle was over, and, like all battles, The real killing began when one side broke and ran, and now the Saxons tried to flee from that field where they had dreamed of a great slaughter, but found only death. Dead men can't join forces with Ida, Aela, or any of the other Saxon kings. So, is it peace then, at last? Perhaps, my friend. Arthur clapped Lancelot on his wide shoulder. For the winter at least, until our enemies sharpen their axes and saxes in spring. An army can't march without food in its belly or ale to drink, so we won't see the Saxons pushing north and west until spring. We have them, Lancelot. Arthur grabbed his friend's muscled shoulder. For the first time, we actually have them. Ida and his sons haven't ventured out from their high crag in Bernicia for 2 summers. Aela and Eomenric fight each other in the south. Warlords fight for lordship of Lindsey. The Saxons are in disarray. Come spring, I shall rally the kingdoms and raise the largest army Britain has seen since the Romans left, and we'll crush the Saxons. We'll march east and south and wash the coast with their blood. But can we really do it? We have to. There will never be another chance like this. The enemy has never been so weak. All we must do is drive the blade home and cut the heart from the invaders' chests. And then? Peace, wives, children, the good things in life. Gaval appeared at Arthur's legs, his tail wagging and his tongue lolling. He bent and scratched the dog behind the ear. Arthur's eyes stung and his shoulders ached. Wounded men groaned and writhed on the ground around him, and Arthur had the overwhelming urge to sit down, to rest, even though the carnage of battle still played out across the blood-soaked field. They spared no Saxon lives that day, and Arthur ordered his men to strip the Saxon corpses of anything of value and leave them to rot on the battlefield. He kept 4 ale barrels and a wain of food for his men, and sent 4 mounted scouts eastwards to seek survivors from the Saxons' raids. A dozen of his black cloaks followed, leading donkey-pulled wagons towards those people who would desperately need their stolen food, ale and goods returned. Arthur's men camped that night in a clearing just inside the forest. Men made makeshift tents from cloaks and old sailcloth, and they made campfires over which flitches of pork and sides of beef turned on spits to fill the woodland with the mouth-watering smell of roasting meat. Dowie had a young warrior clean Arthur's armour and weapons, and as the sun set red over the tree-line, Arthur sat upon a fallen log, wearing only a woolen jerkin and trews. "Here, Lord," said Howell. He handed Arthur a trencher of hard bread, stuffed with steaming meat. Arthur smiled and took the food. He sat before a small fire, ringed with stones, and he stretched the ache from his back and took a bite of roasted beef. The juices ran into his beard, and Arthur's stomach groaned with delight. "Can I sit?" asked Kay. "You are left," and Kay sat beside the fire. "Of course, as long as you don't steal my food like you did when we were boys." "I swear I won't." Kay placed a solemn hand on his chest. "You used to tell Father whenever I took your sweet cakes. You were always his favourite." "What? Are you drunk already? Lunetta was Hector's favourite, and you were always the best with practice swords and spears." Guy laughed and took a swig from an aleskin. "They were good days, running around Cael Igualid without a care in the world." Arthur thought of his spear father, Hector, once the champion of all the Britons, and the man who had raised Arthur like his own son. "It almost seems like a different life. I can still best you, even though you wield Merlin's magic sword." Kay leaned in and nudged Arthur with his shoulder. "I don't doubt it, brother. Just don't tell anyone." "Don't tell anyone what?" said Lancelot, taking a seat beside the fire with an ale skin in each hand. "That Orin of Gwynedd "That Einion of Powys fought better than you today," said Kay. "What? Have you lost your wits? Did you not see me cut down the Saxon leader? I saw you flailing around whilst Orin and Einion fought with the hardiest of the enemy." "How could you not see? I was—" Lancelot was halfway to standing when he noticed the twinkle in Kay's eye and kicked him playfully in the shin. "Bastard!" Orin, Einion, and Idneth approached the fire, each of them rosy-cheeked from drink. "'There's mead in one of those barrels," said Orin, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. "The last time I drank mead, I was sick for a week," Kay replied. "It's fine stuff. They could have brewed it with Gwynedd honey." "Nothing is brewed in Gwynedd but sour ale and pinch-faced women," said Einion. "The only mead or ale I've ever drunk from Powys tasted like cat's piss. How do you know what cat's piss tastes like?" The champions of Powys and Gwynedd turned and fixed one another with steel eyes and jutting chins. "All right," said Arthur. He rose and stood between the two warriors, both outstanding fighters from neighbouring kingdoms. "It's been a long summer, and I thank you and your men for your service. We have recovered much of Logir for our people. Tomorrow you can all march for home and spend the rest of this year with your families." "Truly?" said Orin. "I thought the fighting would never end." "It won't," Arthur thought. "No more ships will come this late into the summer. We know the forces Ida and his son hold beneath their high crag at Dunguaroy in the northeast, and that rival leaders fight for Lindsay's throne in the east. In the south, Eomenric rules Kent, and his men are too busy defending his borders from his Saxon rivals to strike further into our lands." "Eomenric and Ailla are still at war?" asked Lancelot. "So I hear. The South Saxons and the Saxons in Kent fight over Londinium and its river. It's all set up for us. The dice board swept clear, just waiting for the final throw. We shall take our chance in the spring, when more ships will come across the narrow sea. Hopefully those men who look across the water with raiding and plunder in their hearts will hear of what happened today. Perhaps they will hear of a cousin or friend who sailed for Britain and met his end beside a deep forest on a distant battlefield. It might give them pause. That is my hope, that the scops and bards who tell stories to hungry young warriors of Britain's rich land and weak warriors might now also tell stories of our victories, of our champions and how many Saxons, Jutes and Angles we have killed these last years." "Too many to count," said Einion. "And yet still more come," Idneth added. His long, clean-shaven face had become lined, and his short, close-cropped hair showed more silver than black. "Return to your homes, then, with my thanks, but tell your lords that I shall call you to my banner in the spring, when we shall bring the fight to the Saxons once more. My lord Brockvale might want his warriors to stay at home next year," said Einion. "Powys needs her sons." "Not whilst we fight in the borderlands, he doesn't. Remind King Brockvale that he has never known such peace as he has enjoyed these 5 years. No Saxon raids on Powys, no wars, no simple folk captured and enslaved. The only reason Brockvale wants his men to fight at home is to raid Gwynedd, Gwent, and Elmet. But is there more glory in cattle raids against fellow Britons, or in fighting our enemies from across the sea?" "Don't ask me, lord." Einion raised his hands and blew out his cheeks. "I fight where I'm told and kill who I'm told to kill. I'm just letting you know what he will say." "Which I appreciate. Enjoy the food and drink tonight and celebrate our victory. Tomorrow you march for home, as do we all." They cheered those last words, and Arthur took his seat. He ate and drank in silence as the champions boasted to each other about their deeds in battle. They talked of the Saxon warriors each had bested in the years since the battle at the river Douglas. Arthur stared into the flames and thought of Ida, Aela, Jorminrik, and his enemies, looming behind their stout palisades, sharpening their axes and dreaming of conquering the rest of Britain. After the food was gone and the ale flowed too freely, Arthur left them to enjoy the victory. Exhaustion made his eyes feel full of grit, and his limbs ached like he had pulled an ox team all day long. He retreated from the sound of men's laughter and loud stories, and found his leather tent stretched between two trees. "Arthur Pendragon," said a deep voice, startling Arthur. He turned to see a tall man stood beneath the night-darkened boughs. He came closer, and the hairs on Arthur's neck stood up, and he shivered involuntarily. The man came barefoot, his feet crunching through leaf mulch and fallen twigs. He carried a black staff in his right hand, and he glowered at Arthur, his face drawn and wrinkled, with a long hooked nose above a cruel slash of a mouth. The man wore a black tunic, and a cloak of purest white hung about his shoulders. Two great wolfhounds padded out of the gloom and sat beside him, sniffing the night air and licking their whiskers at the smell of meat. "Lord Cadmus," Arthur said to the Druid. The Druids were the priests of the old gods, Britain's gods. They were men of great power who once held sway over all Britain, of similar standing and importance to kings. Arthur had heard tell of their human sacrifices, their power, and the rumours of wizards and dark magic. The Romans had killed all but a few of the Druids when the legions conquered Britain, but some remained upon their holy island of Innes Moon, which some men called Anglesey, which was sacred to the old gods and their dying religion. Despite the growing Christian faith, all men respected and feared the power of the old gods, of the demons and spirits of the forests, lakes, rivers, crags, caves, and springs. Even though their power and influence were diminished from ancient times, people still feared and respected the Druids. Arthur called Cadmus Lord, not because he was a king or commanded a great force of warriors, but out of respect. "Another victory." His voice creaked and cracked like an old timber door. "Another warband stopped." "The gods reward you with battle luck. Excalibur strikes our enemies down, as though wielded by Andraste herself." "The men fight well, and we know our blade work." "You have worshippers of the nailed god in your company, do you not?" Arthur sighed. "Some men who fight under my command are Christians, yes, but they are Britons and love our land as much as any worshipper of the old gods. And yet the priests try to divide us, to drive the churls and simple folk away from our gods. They seek to overthrow our gods. They are a curse and should be driven from our land and thrown back into the sea." "I assume you haven't come to me unbidden from the forest to scold me about Christians?" "No, I have not." He frowned, bushy white eyebrows pinching over his hard eyes like storm clouds. "I come from Inesmon, at Merlin's behest." "Merlin? I've not seen Merlin for over a year." "He has been busy, as have we all, travelling the length and breadth of Britain, seeking to protect it from those who would cast it asunder. Foreign gods assail us, not just the nailed god, but cruel and wicked Saxon gods. A war rages above and below our world, Lord Arthur, and we Druids fight just as hard as you, not with sword and spear, but in the realm beyond our own." "What message do you bear from Merlin?" "He bade me warn you that the northern kingdoms unite against you. that the northern kingdoms of Reged, Lothian, and Gododin form an alliance to attack you and wrest the title of Pendragon away. They have powerful allies, the Gwyllion Nimue, who sits at Urian's side in the Bear Fort, connives and conjures against you. Arthur paced back and forth, his forehead creased, fists clenched. Do they march? Not yet, but war looms. A fight amongst our own kingdoms which threatens everything you have fought for. Damn those northern fools! We are so close to the victory we have always dreamed of. Within a season of reclaiming this entire island for our people. If we fight amongst ourselves, we open the door for the Saxons to spread further, to creep out of Llogir and reclaim the land so recently returned to our people. Just so. Enemies surround you, Arthur Pendragon, and Merlin calls to you. I will heed his call, but first I must go home to Drumnonia to see to my responsibilities there. Very well. Cadmus turned and swept his white cloak about him, striding back into the darkness with his great wolfhounds slinking beside him. Perhaps he will meet you there, for the need is dire. Our aims teeter on a knife edge. War looms in the north, so prepare yourself. Arthur reached into his tent and grabbed the stone scepter he had taken from King Ida in battle long ago. The cold stone helped Arthur think. Its dome top felt like bone beneath his thumb. The scepter seemed ancient to Arthur, as though kings of old had used it as a symbol of their power for countless generations, that some small piece of their wisdom lay trapped beneath its hard, chiseled exterior. In truth, he wasn't sure where the Saxon king of Bernicia had come across it. All Arthur knew was that it helped him see beyond the battlefields and the bickering over one god or another. If Merlin was right and the northern kingdoms were rising against him, then Arthur's rule was in peril, as was the future of Britain itself. A war between the great kingdoms of Britain in the time before Arthur's birth had laid Britain low. In the days of Uther, Ambrosius, Urien, Letan, Luadog, and Cadwallon Longhand, Britons had fought each other, led to it by King Vortigern. The old kings of Britain had united to fight Vortigern, the usurper of Deira, and the army of Saxon warriors he brought across the sea. They were the first to arrive on Britain's shores, invited by Vortigern as he sought to use their brutality to subdue his enemies. Hengist and Horsa were the first seafarers to arrive, and their people had never ceased coming. Arthur lay down beneath wool and furs and closed his eyes, listening to the victory celebrations. But all he could hear were the lamentations of conquered people, the screams of the wounded and the cries of the displaced. His had been a life filled with war, blood, and death, and now his greatest challenge would come from his own people. Chapter 3. Arthur's army disbanded. Its commanders led their men north, south, and west to their distant homes. Lancelot, Arthur, and Kay rode south before the marching column of black cloaks and Kay's 200 men, once warriors of Reged, who had renounced their oaths to King Urien to follow Kay and fight for Arthur. The moon waxed and waned as Arthur's warband journeyed into the barley and wheat fields of Britain's southwest. They marched past villages and farmsteads, dikes, hilltop settlements, coppiced woodland, and kept to old Roman roads. Folk came out to bow and wave to the warriors, and they marvelled at Arthur astride Lombre in his black cloak and coat of chainmail. They gaped at Excalibur, for few amongst the people of Britain had not heard Merlin's stories of how Arthur had pulled the blade from a stone to make himself Pendragon. Merlin and Nimue had spread such tales across the land in the days when they were lovers, before enmity had come between them like a disease. Merlin's deep cunning had filled the people's minds with tales of sorcery and ancient magic, and prepared them for Arthur's rise. Those tales had bound folk to Arthur's legend, and after years of suffering and defeat, people had believed that they could defeat the Saxons, that a god-forged sword and a warrior favoured by Merlin could deliver victory. Arthur embraced the legends and stories. He let them flow about him like a warm cloak. Once the stories had irked him, made him uncomfortable, that Merlin crafted such tales to deceive people and make them believe Arthur was a great hero, a legendary figure, which Arthur the man struggled to live up to. But now he understood Merlin's cunning, understood that folk needed that belief. So he waved to the men and women who bowed to him at roadsides, the men who ploughed and sowed, and the women who spun and wove. And when crowds grew large, Arthur drew Excalibur and let them marvel at her gleaming blade. Common folk reached out to touch the warriors' cloaks and offered them bread, mead, and small talismans for luck. At night, men would slip away to find grateful maids and warm their beds. But Arthur's warriors always returned in the morning. They always came back to their warlord, the man to whom they had all sworn oaths of service. On a warm, wet day, where the sky was the colour of dirty boots, Arthur and his warband reached Dunavaria, once home to Uther Pendragon's summer court, and its fortress, known as the Fist of Dumnonia. "Home," said Lancelot with a grin, as three girls leading a cart full of turves gazed up at his ruggedly handsome face. "Home," Arthur agreed. He had slept more nights in the field than he had in the Fist's warm bedroom, and ate more meals out in the open than he had in its sprawling hall. It was far from Benwick, Lancelot's birthplace across the narrow sea, but his friend had lived and fought beside Arthur like a brother, and Lancelot had spilled enough of his own and other men's blood to call Dumnonia home. A ring of Roman stone walls circled the Fist, with a high stone gate with two arched entrances and stout oak doors. The walled part of the Fist could hold 100 warriors and their families, but a sprawling settlement of wattle houses spread around the fortress on all sides, and a cloud of dirty smoke sat above it. A ditch surrounded the walls, and the town contained the palace, barracks, feasting hall, and dwellings within the walls, and then ramshackle houses of wattle, thatch, and turf clung to the outside of the walls like limpets. That outer settlement sprawled beneath a cloud of dirty smoke, with its smithies, brothels, seers, pigs, chickens, urchins, and goats. A tanner's yard on the edges of the settlement stank of stale piss, and the warriors grumbled at the stench as they approached the Fist's high gates. Those gates creaked open, pushed by two guards whose boots splashed in a rain puddle. "Welcome home!" called a familiar voice as the three riders reined in before the gate. A big man strolled through the opening, hands on his hips and a green cloak thrown back over his broad shoulders. "I hope you have the hearth fire burning, Maligant," said Arthur, inclining his head in greeting. Maligant was long-faced, with a short beard, and his dark hair hung in two braids about the sides of his face, with the back of his head shaved in the Dumnonian fashion. He had once been the captain of Uther's warriors, a skilled warrior and a champion, who now commanded the warriors Arthur left to guard the city and its queen. "You picked a fine day for it." "The men are wetter than an otter's pocket," Kay said, rain dripping down his handsome face. "Best get them into their homes instead of talking out here like washerwomen." "I've missed you too, Lord Kay. Come on in." "Right, lads," Dowie called to the men. He turned to face the eager-eyed spearmen. He took off his wide-brimmed hat and let the rain pour from it before placing it back on his head. You can fall out. You're dismissed. Go home to your wives, and may the sound of your humping drown out the sound of my wife's complaining." The men cheered, waving their spears, and then ran through the puddles and mud to disperse into the snarl of paths, alleys and lanes to find their homes. Maligant led the riders inside, where stewards took the horses so that Arthur and his companions could walk the rest of the way home. Maligant led them through the twist of cobbled pathways towards Arthur's hall. Faces stared out at Arthur from the lime-washed buildings, topped with a patchwork of fresh golden thatch and older, rotting thatch. Rain pounded the cobbles and hammered against Arthur's metal helmet. People huddled beneath overhanging roofs to stay dry, and they bowed in deference as their High King and Steward of Dumnonia passed. Arthur's Hall loomed above the old city, a lofty building with high walls and a red-tiled roof patched here and there with brown clay tiles. Maligant led them along a sheltered walkway flanked by white pillars, where ivy climbed across the cracked, finely chiseled stone. They entered a wide hall, airy and clean, and Kay ran to warm his hands before the roaring hearth. As he always did, Arthur treaded lightly upon the scene, etched into the floor by thousands of tiny tiles, fearful of his heavy boots breaking the faded but startlingly brilliant picture of fish leaping around a chariot. Tall windows and square holes cut into the whitewashed walls showed glimpses of the bleak sky outside. Men and women in finely woven garments of red, green, and blue came from the shadows to peer at Arthur as priests wove about them, whispering prayers and making the sign of the cross. Courtiers and too many priests, Arthur thought. Merlin would not approve. Guinevere craved a court full of bards and scops, of harps and flutes playing as the wealthy and well-garbed discussed matters of court, philosophy, religion, and courtly love. Arthur's boots squelched on the old, tiny Roman stones, leaving dirty brown mud stains, despite his best efforts to tread lightly. A swarthy priest in a brown robe stood amongst a clutch of other sour-faced priests. They clasped the wooden and silver crosses at their necks and hissed prayers, which Arthur assumed were to ward off the evil of his pagan presence. He was the Pendragon that could run them out of the fist should he wish, or kill them with an order and a wave of his hand. But to do that was to anger their god and the ever-increasing number of Christ-worshippers throughout Britain's kingdoms. The priests reminded Arthur of the times he had visited the Grand Hall, when it had belonged to Uther. He had fought single combat there against Minogue the Boar, and won, splashing the monstrous warrior's blood over the tiny stone-pictured floor. Then he had faced Uther's wrath and challenged the Pendragon to fight. Arthur shivered at the memory. Merlin and Nimue had been united beside Arthur that day, and the bishop and his priests had slithered away from Nimue's stone-encrusted teeth and Gwylion's power. Uther had been a fearsome man, a high king for many years, a warrior of famous strength and cruelty, who had led Britain in the days of the Great War, when his brother Ambrosius had wielded Excalibur, and the traitor Vortigern had first brought Saxon warriors to Britain's shores. The hall's rear door creaked open, and a bishop in a tall mitre strode through it, carrying a long white staff curved like a shepherd's crook. A woman followed, hair shining like burnished gold in the firelight. Her face was long and gentle, with full lips, and her eyes were the green of a summer sea. She glanced at him and smiled, and Arthur could not keep the grin from his face or his cheeks from flushing with embarrassment, just as he did every time he saw her across a crowded room. She was his queen, once the Princess of Camelot, Guinevere, the most beautiful woman Arthur had ever seen. Guinevere stood aside, and a man marched ahead of the queen and the bishop. He carried a brass-coloured trumpet and wore a long white cloth robe draped about his shoulders in the Roman fashion. The man's sandals flapped upon the stone floor, and he ascended Arthur's high platform, upon which sat his throne. More people in fine robes filtered into the hall from behind Arthur.